right, Mr. Clarke, any other comment?
I just think they're extremely argumentative in the context of this witness's testimony. The way they're worded and the way they're presented, I think, would do nothing but mislead the jury.
All right, objections noted. All right, let's have the jury, please. Dr. Gerdes? All right, the record should reflect all the jurors have rejoined us. Dr. John Gerdes is on the witness stand again, undergoing redirect examination by Mr. Scheck.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. Dr. Gerdes, Mr. Clarke asked you quite a few questions today about retyping by other laboratories.
Yes.
Now, in terms of an initial cross-contamination of samples at the LAPD, does it matter how many other laboratories typed the samples if they were cross-contaminated initially at LAPD?
No, once you've accidentally or some other way transferred that DNA from one sample to another, it doesn't matter how many gene systems, how many different labs, it's always going to transfer, it's always going to type as the DNA that was transferred.
Now, Mr. Clarke showed you what's been marked 564F, which is a series of slides. If I could put this up on there, please. With respect to typing performed at the LAPD laboratory, with respect to 3 of the 5 Bundy blood drop samples. You put that up there, please. In terms of this,
Getting washed out here.
yeah,
There we go.
there we go. Now, listed on this chart are only items 48, 50, and 52. Is that correct?
Correct.
In terms of what was handled by Colin Yamauchi between 9 o'clock and 11 on the morning of June 14th, were samples 47, 48, 49, 50, 52, and the Rockingham glove, all sampled at that time with Mr. Simpson's reference sample.
That's correct.
Right. And where did that occur?
That occurred in the evidence processing.
All right. And in terms of the drying of samples and packaging of samples, were items 47, 48, 49, 50, and 52, along with Rockingham items, including item number 12, the drops taken from the foyer of Mr. Simpson's home, were they all taken out of plastic bags, wet swatches, and put into test tubes by Mr. Fung and Miss Mazzola without changing gloves and without changing papers on June 13th, as is indicated under the section drying on 6/13?
Objection misstates the evidence.
Sustained.
Well, based on your review of the testimony, did Miss Mazzola and Mr. Fung take out of plastic bags swatches that they described were wet, put them into test tubes for drying on the evening or June 13th, which included 47, 48, 49, 50, and 52, and the different samples collected at Rockingham?
They did.
All right. And that would comport with the section of the chart marked drying, correct?
That's correct.
And on June 14th, in the morning, did Mr. Fung and Miss Mazzola scrape out of test tubes using a pipette, without changing gloves and without changing paper, put into bindles the swatches that they had previously dried on June 13th?
They did.
Now, what is your opinion about the way that Mr. Fung and Miss Mazzola handled those samples on June 13th and on June 14th in terms of the danger of cross-contamination?
I think there's significant risk of cross-contamination because they didn't change gloves, because they create aerosols when they try and scrape these little swatches out of the tube, because they handle the reference sample at the same time as all of these other evidence items, and because certain
Excuse me.
items,
Sorry, objection misstates the testimony.
Overruled.
and because certain items, a number of items, in fact, were mixed between crime scenes in terms of being handled at the same time.
Incidentally, item number 12, the drops from the floor in the foyer from Mr. Simpson's residence, was that among the last samples collected on June 13th?
Objection, no foundation.
Sustained.
Do you know if those were among the last samples collected by Mr. Fung and Miss Mazzola on June 13th?
Same objection.
Sustained. Sustained.
All right.
Foundation, counsel.
Are you familiar with the testimony and the records concerning the collection of the items at Rockingham?
Yes.
All right. Was item number 12 one of the last items collected on June 13th?
Yes.
And in terms of DNA concentration, was the concentration of item number 12, in terms of human DNA, higher significantly than the Bundy blood drops?
It was.
All right. And when that sample is handled in conjunction with the Bundy blood drops in the fashion that you've just reviewed on June 13th and on June 14th, does that create a danger of cross-contamination with that sample?
Yes, because you're handling a sample that has a large amount of DNA with samples that have degraded and small amounts of DNA.
And the samples that had degraded in small amounts of DNA were which samples?
The Bundy blood drops.
Now, also, well, could we circle on this the evidence processing room on this flow chart is indicated 613 and 614. Huh? Can we draw a circle around that, Mr. Harris? And may I suggest pink? Nope. That's the evidence control room. No. All right. Thank you. Dr. Gerdes, is it your testimony that it is in these procedures on June 13th and June 14th that unacceptable risks of cross-contamination occurred?
Yes, the risk occurred at the very first step that's circled.
And if the cross-contamination to those samples, the Bundy blood drops and the Rockingham glove, occurred at that time, would results be replicated by Cellmark, DOJ, your own laboratory if you type these kinds of samples, Dr. Blake, Dr. Henry Lee, or anyone else you found, assuming that they performed the tests correctly?
They would.
Thank you. Can we print that out and mark that as defense next meeting?
I'm sorry. 1311.
And with the court's permission, could we turn the lights up and I'll go over to a chart?
All right, this is 259, I believe the Bundy Results Board.
And, Your Honor, at the same time, I'd like to put up on the Elmo what's previously been marked as Defendants 1165. These are the charts of the massive nanograms of DNA. And Dr. Gerdes, starting with what's marked as 47,
Yes.
was that one of the Bundy blood drops that was handled by Dennis Fong and Andrea Mazzola on June 13th?
Yes.
Was it one of the items that Mr. Yamauchi handled at the same period that he was handling Mr. Simpson's reference sample?
Objection, no foundation.
Overruled.
This is when Mr. Yamauchi took out the stopper and the blood went through the chem wipe onto his glove.
That's correct.
48 the same,
Correct.
49 the same,
Yes.
50 the same,
Yes.
52 the same.
Yes.
Now 52, in terms of which of the Bundy blood drop swatches were opened up from the bindles when Mr. Yamauchi began handling them on the morning of June 14th, which of the items did he handle first?
Number 52.
Are you familiar with the estimate of the amount of human DNA in each of the Bundy blood drops, 47 through 52, as testified to by Gary Sims based on his calculations from slot blots, yield gels, and the size of the swatches and their weight?
Yes, I am.
All right? Do you regard those as accurate estimates as to the total number of nanograms of human DNA in those items?
Yes, they're consistent with his notes.
All right. On And in terms of the yield gels, is it a fair statement that 47, 48, 49, 50, and 52 were samples that were severely degraded in terms of bacterial DNA?
Objection vague.
Sustained.
What was the status of those samples in terms of bacterial degradation?
They were all extremely degraded.
Now, with respect to 52, is this the RFLP result that you are concerned about?
Yes.
How many nanograms of human DNA did Robin Cotton testify went into that particular result?
She testified there was 25 nanograms.
Is that different than all the other RFLP results?
All the other RFLP results have more DNA. Adequate DNA. More.
At least 4 times more.
That's correct. At least 4 times more DNA.
Were any other of the samples from which RFLP results obtained, were those handled in the presence of the reference sample and in the period where the reference sample was handled?
Objection, no foundation.
Sustained.
Is it your testimony, sir, that there were unacceptable risks of cross-contamination that are associated with the results on 47, 48, 49, 50, and 52?
Yes.
Excuse me, objection needed.
I'll let it stand what it was.
Now, there are frequency estimates on the right side of this chart for all those items.
Yes, there are.
Could you distinguish for us between frequencies and error rates?
Yes, I mean, these are an estimate of at what percentage of the population or what incidence in the population you might find all of these genetic markers. Error rate has to do with an evaluation of the laboratory itself and the question of how good are they in terms of how often they might make a mistake. And so on the one hand, you're talking about how many, if you do 100 samples, how often would you make an error?
I'm sorry.
And on the other hand, you're talking about, assuming there were no errors, how often would you find this at random in the population?
Do you agree with the recommendation of the National Research Council that laboratory error rate ought to be measured by the use of external blind proficiency tests on samples that replicate casework?
Objection, hearsay, no foundation.
I do.
Does the LAPD have such a program?
No, they don't.
In terms of their open proficiency tests, in your judgment, do those proficiency tests replicate casework?
No, they don't include mixtures or degraded DNA samples, DNAs at low concentrations.
In terms of the study that you performed looking at all the strips and runs at the LAPD laboratory, do you have a judgment as to how personnel at that laboratory handle samples?
Objection, no foundation.
Sustained.
From your study, is there an objective basis for making an assessment as to the risk of error in handling samples at the LAPD?
Same objection.
Sustained. It's vague and overbroad. You need to pare it down a little.
In your study of contamination at the Los Angeles Police Department, in terms of their runs and strips, did you make an assessment of extraction controls versus amplification controls?
I did.
And what was the significance of that?
Objection vague.
Oh,
The significance is that the contamination was found predominantly in the reagent extraction controls.
And what does that indicate about this phase of the DNA process where errors were occurring?
It indicates that in handling samples and the early stages, the extraction stages in both of those areas, that's where the contamination is being introduced in terms of what we can objectively look at, which is their record on doing known samples over the course of that time period.
And does that include the evidence processing room as one of those stages that the extraction control would cover?
I believe it would.
Now, turning to the results from 117, the rear gate. Are you aware from your review of the testimony as to the amount of DNA on that sample?
Yes, there's 150 nanograms.
In your judgment, is that significantly different than the amount of DNA on the other Bundy blood drops?
Yes, it is.
Do you know when that sample was collected?
Yes.
When?
I don't know the exact date, but I believe it was collected in August,
July 3rd?
July, later, after a month or so after
The
the
Bundy
initial
blood-
samples.
And in terms of bacterial degradation, do you agree with the assessment of Gary Sims that 117 did not show evidence on yield gels of bacterial degradation?
Objection, no foundation.
Sustain.
Are you aware of Mr. Sims' testimony and assessment as to the level of bacterial degradation on item 117?
Yes,
Do you agree with it?
yes,
Were those samples degraded?
no.
Dr. Gerdes, does it make any sense to you, based on your knowledge of DNA quantitation, that samples collected on June 13th from the same area, that is 47, 48, 49, 50, and 52, would be so degraded in terms of bacterial contamination, bacteria, and 117 would show no evidence of that?
Objection, no foundation. Calls for speculation.
Sustain.
All right. Does this data, in terms of the dates of collection and the conditions where those samples were collected, make sense to you scientifically?
Same objection.
Sustain.
What is your assessment of the, can you explain the difference in DNA amounts and degradation on 117 versus 47 through 52?
Same objection.
Sustain.
Are you aware of the testimony that the same methods of collection were employed by Dennis Fung in terms of putting the swatches from 117 into a plastic bag, taking them to the laboratory, and drying them in test tubes and sampling the next day, as was followed with 47, 48, 49, 50, and 52?
Objection misstates the evidence.
Overruled.
Yes, I'm aware of that.
All right. Given that the same procedures were followed, and given that all these items were in the locations where they were recovered, does it make any sense to you scientifically that there should be no evidence of degradation in 117 and so much evidence of degradation in 47 through 52?
Objection, no foundation. Calls for speculation.
Sustain.
At photographs of the scene where these different items were collected.
Yes, I've seen photographs.
All right. So you're familiar with where they're collected.
Yes,
In terms of their locations, in terms of the methods of same methods of collection, and in terms of the results with respect to bacterial degradation and yield of human DNA, do these results, what is your assessment of these results?
Same objection, same grounds.
Sustain.
These are foundation.
Foundation, Counselor. It's a forensic setting.
Dr. Gerdes, do you have a background in microbiology?
yes, I do.
Does microbiology involve an assessment of the effects of bacteria on DNA?
Yes, it could.
Is that what you got your PhD in?
Yes,
Is that what, have you relied on your microbiology background in terms of your postdoctorate work and your work as a DNA lab director?
yes,
Do those principles, basic scientific principles of microbiology and molecular genetics that you've been trained in, Do those have application to an assessment of blood stains, bacteria, and substrates?
Yes.
Have you read the literature from forensic laboratories that you've called demonstration papers that deal with degradation of samples taken from crime scenes?
Yes.
Based on all of that, what is your assessment in terms of the data that the Bundy blood drops were severely degraded with bacteria and the rear gate sample 117 was not, and the rear gate sample had 150 nanograms of DNA, which was 5 times higher than any Bundy blood drop sample?
Same objection, same grounds.
Oral.
It doesn't seem to make sense to me that you should see about the same level of degradation, and in fact, on 117, which is an older sample, it should have more degradation.
Thank you. Show you what's been marked as Prosecutions 260, entitled Results of DNA Analysis on the Bronco Automobile. Were the results of the steering wheel number 29 from the laboratories a 1.2, 1.14?
Yes, they were.
And taken at face value, would that indicate a mixture of some of the, could it indicate a mixture of somebody with a 1.1, 1.2, and somebody that's a 4,
Yes.
a 4.4, I should say,
Yes.
and somebody that is a 1.24,
Yes.
and somebody that is a 1.14?
Yes.
And that result does not match, on the face of it, Mr. Goldman, correct?
That's correct.
He would be excluded from the steering wheel.
You would.
Now, with respect to item number 31 and item number 30, were those the only results from the Bronco console that were removed on June 14th?
Objection, no foundation.
Sustained.
In terms of the samples removed from the Bronco on June 14th, I believe on direct examination you indicated what about those?
Those are the samples that were removed on that date.
Right? And that,
The low numbers indicate samples that were collected on that early date. The high numbers, the hundreds, those are the later samples.
so 303, 304, 305 were removed on August 26th.
Correct.
Now, in terms of 30 and 31, Mr. Clarke, on his cross-examination of you, you recall, just pulled out this board and asked you to read the results, correct?
That's correct.
He didn't ask you whether you believe that the result on 31 was scientifically acceptable.
Objection, irrelevant.
Oral.
No, he didn't ask me.
All right? Your Honor, I'd like to show another board over this for a second.
All right, Mr. Scheck, this is defense exhibit.
$1309.
Thank you.
Entitled Bronco Console Stains Collected June 14th, 1994. Dr. Gerdes, in light of the 1.3 appearing on the quality assurance sample 86, quality control sample 816, and the positive control, the intensities of those dots, the call that was made by DOJ, do you believe that it is scientifically acceptable, and I ask you this question to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty, to make a call that there is a one contributor with a 1.34 in this sample?
Absolutely not. You can't tell if that's real or not because it's on the control. These faint signals, you can't arbitrarily say it's real here and it's not real down there. So you can't make that call.
I'd like to show 1310. Is entitled Bundy Blood Drops LAPD item number 53, DOJ
Yes.
typing.
Yes.
Do you see an inconsistency in the call with respect to the 1.3 on LAPD item 52 and the call on the 1.3 on sample 31?
Objection leading, also argumentative.
Sustain. Phrase the question.
What is your view of the call that was made on item 52 with respect to the 1.3 allele and the call that was made on item 31?
Objection, no foundation.
Well, this just shows the subjectivity of this. In this case, the 1.3 is ignored in this particular item. On the other item, it's counted. And on the controls, it's ignored. So there's no scientific basis as to how you would determine one of these is real and one is not real, other than, I don't know how you would decide.
Now, Dr. Gerdes, if we were to assume that the 1.3 is real on item number 52, I ask you to keep that assumption in mind. First question is, out of all the different systems used, is the DQ alpha system the most sensitive?
Yes, it is.
So if I ask you to assume that DNA on the Bundy blood drops 47, 48, 49, 50, and 52 is degrading because of bacteria, and that 52, on sample 52, could that 1.3, because DQ alpha is the most sensitive system, if you assume that to be real,
Yes.
be DNA from another contributor?
Objection calls for speculation.
Sustain.
Well, let us assume that DNA on item number 53 underwent a 52 underwent a process of bacterial degradation. Do you have that in mind?
I have it.
Let us further assume that there was cross-contamination with Mr. Simpson's reference sample on June 14th at the LAPD laboratory. Do you have that in mind?
Yes.
All right. In theory, if that 1.3 is real, could that represent the contribution of the original source on sample 152, which had degraded,
Same objection.
Yes, it definitely could.
if it were real?
Yes, if it were real.
Your Honor, I think that I don't have another minute and 30
You don't
seconds.
have, you're done?
No. I don't have much more, but I don't have another minute and 30 seconds
All right.
in this line.
All right, why don't you take that down for me, please? All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take our recess for the morning session. Please remember all my admonitions to you. Don't discuss the case amongst yourselves. Don't form any opinions about the case. Don't conduct any deliberations till the matter has been submitted to you. Do not allow anybody to communicate with you with regard to the case. We'll stand in recess until 1:30. All right, Dr. Gerdes, 1:30. On the record in the Simpson matter, all parties are again present. Mr. Cochran, something we need to take up?
Yes, just want to bring something to the court's attention. Your Honor, over the weekend, one of the real fine reporters, Robin Clarke, lost his life, and I wanted to just propose to the court that either we have a moment of silence sometime this afternoon or adjourn in his memory this afternoon, whatever the court thinks is appropriate in that regard.
Yes, we had left his seat vacant this morning.
I appreciate that. So if the court thinks we can do something else, we appreciate it. Thank you.
All right, thank you, counsel. All right, Deputy McNair, let's have the jurors, please. Seated. Dr. Gerdes, would you resume the witness stand, please? All right, good afternoon again, Doctor.
Good afternoon.
You're reminded, sir, you are still under oath. Mr. Scheck, you may continue with your redirect.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. Dr. Gerdes, let me discuss with you briefly the results on the glove. I'd like to show you first the results of DNA analysis Rockingham glove, which is prosecution's 272B. Now, Dr. Gerdes, Mr. Clarke asked you about the results from RFLP tests that were consistent with Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman on various areas of the glove, specifically G1, G2, G3, G4, G9, that were confirmed by RFLP, well, like G4, I'm sorry, that were confirmed by RFLP tests, correct?
Yes.
G11, G10, and G13 are the D1S80 results in the wrist area of the glove, which produced results with Mr. Simpson. Is that correct?
That's what they state, yes.
Are there any RFLP results confirming that result?
No.
putting on this is Defense 1186, Mr. Yamauchi's diagram of the glove found at Rockingham. Dr. Gerdes, is this diagram reflect what your understanding is of what Mr. Yamauchi did on the morning of June 14th between 9 and 10 o'clock when he handled the glove from Rockingham after having handled Mr. Simpson's reference sample where he had that incident where took off the top and the blood went through the Chemex and onto his glove?
Objection leading.
Sustained.
Well, as far as the D1S80 results from the wrist area of the glove, what is your opinion as to the acceptable risks of cross-contamination with respect to those results?
Objection, no foundation.
Overruled.
They were handled at the same time or shortly after Mr. Simpson's reference sample was handled. The testimony states that the sample had leaked, and under those circumstances, it represents substantial risk that contamination could have happened.
Are the D1S80 results in terms of the amount of DNA found in the wrist area of that glove consistent with cross-contamination from a sample handling error?
Objection calls for speculation.
Sustained.
Move to strike the answer.
The answer is stricken.
On the basis of the amounts of DNA in those D1S80 tests and your review of the procedures that Mr. Yamauchi used, what do you believe about the level of risk of cross-contamination with respect to those results?
Objection, no foundation calls for speculation.
Overruled.
There's substantial risk of cross-contamination under those circumstances.
This is Defense 1308, testing results, Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman reference samples. Now, Mr. Clarke asked you a series of questions about controls and evidence of cross-contamination from the way that samples were handled in the evidence processing room on June 14th and June 15th. You recall those?
The questions regarding, yes.
All right. With respect to cross-contamination occurring in the handling of samples by Mr. Yamauchi on June 15th, specifically item 12, the last blood sample collected from the foyer in Mr. Simpson's home, and the Colbrand-Simpson reference sample and the Ronald Goldman reference sample, do you believe that the results shown on this board are consistent with cross-contamination that was then retyped in two different laboratories, Cellmark and DOJ?
Objection, no foundation calls for speculation and leading.
Overruled.
Yes.
Are the results from this board part of the basis for your opinion that there were unacceptable risks of cross-contamination in the way Mr. Yamauchi handled those samples on June 14th and June 15th?
Yes, these results are consistent with evidence that cross-contamination actually happened.
Now, Dr. Gerdes, you were asked show you what is. Oops. This is Defense 1297, a chart depicting runs and strips May through July of 1994. Run contamination, strip contamination, and/or artifacts. Now, Dr. Gerdes, you were asked quite a number of questions on cross-examination about the distinction you made when analyzing strips, where you put that you indicated they were strip contamination and/or artifacts. You recall those?
I do.
And I call your attention to prosecution 66, 566. You see that?
Yes.
What is that strip?
These are a series of strips that the prosecution showed to demonstrate the weak 1.1, I believe in reference to discussing the DX loop.
All right. And this is the 1.1 in the presence of the 1, correct?
Correct.
And was it your testimony that in looking at that, one could not tell if those 1.1s were contaminants or artifacts?
That's correct. Under this circumstance, you can't really tell if that's an artifact or a contaminant.
And is that why you made the distinction when you identified the strips?
Yes, in terms of the strips, that's the reason why I did not really try to differentiate between the two, because in many cases, in situations such as this, you can't tell.
Now, what relationship does a result such as depicted on 566, where you can't tell if it's a contaminant or artifact, have in terms of making erroneous typings?
Objection vague.
Standing phrase question.
Why is it? What are the problems you see in a result such as depicted on 566 in terms of making an interpretation of the strip?
Well, if you look at the strip that has the 1.1 allele, the weak 1.1 allele, if this were a crime scene specimen, the interpretation of that would be that particular item would type as a 1.2, 1.2, because you can see the 1.2 signal here is dark and the 1 is dark. And for that reason, this would be probably typed as a 1.2, 1.2, but because of the weak 1.1, most likely they would express the fact that that was present there and visible. And so it would be a 1.2, 1.2 consistent with a contributor with a 1.1. So it would be consistent with an individual with a 1.1, 1.1, or an individual with a 1.1, 1.2. So that obviously makes this that artifact has the potential of falsely accusing an individual who's a 1.1, 1.2, when in fact the
Excuse me,
typing
objection.
result is from a 1.2, 1.2.
Calls for speculation, no foundation.
Well, Doctor, let me see if I can try to put this in as plain as English as I can. Is the existence of a faint dot like that in a mixture, can that cause an error?
Yes, and it doesn't matter if it's an artifact or a real contaminant. Either way, it can cause an error.
Are dots of that intensity similar to the 1.3 dot we saw before on item 31 of the Bronco console?
Yes.
We can turn up. This is Defense 1295. Dr. Gerdes, you recall Mr. Clarke asking you questions about whether or not two analysts ever did samples on the same day in your calculation of runs. Remember that?
I remember that.
Remember he asked you if you were sure about that?
Yes,
All right. Have you rechecked your data?
yes,
Are you sure that two analysts didn't do strips on the same day?
yes.
Now, do these runs, as you recorded them by month, represent contamination, definite contamination on the day all the strips were run?
Yes, at this point, they're definite contamination because I take all of the strips on a given date and I can look in the context of what's in all of those strips so that you can confirm with one strip whether you're seeing the same thing in more than one strip.
So this chart represents definite contamination, no ambiguity about artifacts as far as you're concerned.
At this point, that's correct.
By the standards that you are familiar with to accredit DNA laboratories, given this level of contamination in runs, in your opinion, would the Los Angeles Police Department be allowed to operate?
Objection, no foundation, calls for speculation.
Sustain.
Are you familiar with the standards used to regulate DNA laboratories in clinical applications?
Yes,
By those standards, would be allowed to operate with this level of contamination?
Same objection.
Sustain.
Dr. Gerdes, you were, excuse me. You were asked a whole series of questions by Mr. Clarke in regard to the use of PCR in other clinical applications. Do you recall those?
I do.
Are you against the use of PCR technology per se?
No, I'm not.
Do you use it yourself?
I do.
Have you developed PCR tests yourself, such as the CMV test?
Yes.
If PCR-based test is reliable for some clinical applications, does that mean it is reliable for all others?
No.
Does that mean it is reliable for use on forensic samples?
No.
Does the reliability of a PCR-based technique depend on the standards and the quality of the lab that's using the technique?
Absolutely.
Does it depend on the nature of the samples being tested?
Yes.
Does the fact that the DQ Alpha kit is sold commercially with a user guide mean that this technique is reliable for all forensic uses by all forensic laboratories?
No.
Doctor, have you read, Mr. Clarke asked you a whole series of questions about kits. Do you recall those?
Yes.
All right. Are you familiar with the discussion in the NRC report with respect to the kits that were used in this case?
Yes, I am.
Do you rely on that in formulating your opinions?
Yes.
Your Honor, we would like to, I've shown this to Mr. Clarke, like to put a slide on the screen.
Proceed.
Would the court like to see it first? Just a second.
Mrs. Robertson, when is defense next in order?
1312?
Before it's displayed, Your Honor.
Yes.
just read this. I included two extra sentences that I told him I wouldn't
Right.
include. Do you agree with the following statement in the NRC report? One commercial kit for forensic PCR analysis has been marketed. Now, let me just stop there. What kit is that?
At that time, that was the DQ Alpha kit.
Other kits will probably be ready for commercial market soon. What kits would those be?
The polymarker and the D1S80.
The committee sees a potential for introduction of unreliable kits and the misuse of kits. The existence of a kit suggests ease of use and low chance of technical error. The committee believes that non-expert laboratories will run a significant chance of error in using kits. Do you agree with that?
I do.
What is your opinion about this what the NRC said, and the LAPD laboratory in this case?
Objection vague.
I believe that the situation we've seen here is precisely what the NRC is talking about here.
And why is that?
Objection calls for speculation.
Why is that?
Because of the LAPD has made substantial errors and have failed to see the subtleties that are critical to interpretation of this kind of testing due to the fact that they were inexperienced.
So just the fact that one has a kit doesn't mean that you can apply it correctly.
That's correct.
Dr. Gerdes, very quickly, you were asked a lot of questions about proficiency tests. Does it make a difference in proficiency tests that the tests involve samples that are just like the ones that you deal with in casework?
Objection asked and answered.
On redirect?
Well,
All right,
I mean,
I'll just forget it all. I think
it's a point
Why
we've
don't you
made.
go? It's a point. Recall, Mr. Clarke asked you about the laminar flow hood in your and the record you made in your notes, correct?
I remember that.
All right. Can you please explain when you realized that the LAPD did not have a laminar flow hood?
That was on my second visit. The first visit I hadn't noticed that.
Is there any question in your mind that that hood is not a laminar flow hood?
None whatsoever.
Is the fact that it's not a laminar flow hood, does that create dangers of contamination in the laboratory?
Absolutely.
Is a laminar flow hood a fundamental in terms of taking precautions against contamination in a DNA laboratory?
Yes.
Is it disturbing to you that the Los Angeles Police Department DNA laboratory was not aware that its hood was not a laminar flow hood?
Objection leading, argumentative.
Sustained.
What is the significance of this hood not being a laminar flow hood in terms of the level of competence and knowledge of the personnel at the LAPD DNA laboratory?
Objection argumentative, no foundation.
Sustained. Rephrase the question.
In terms of the ability, based on your experience as a DNA laboratory director, what is your opinion about laboratory personnel being unaware of the nature of the hood they're using when processing samples?
Same objection, same grounds.
Sustained.
In terms of the reliability of the procedures used at the Los Angeles Police Department in handling DNA samples, What, in your judgments, is the significance of their failure to know that their hood was not a laminar flow hood,
Same objection, same grounds.
Sustained.
which the Granda's conclusion?
The issue here is, what's the benefit to having a laminar flow hood versus what's there?
Thank you.
That's the real issue.
What's the benefit of having a laminar flow hood versus a chemical hood? Thank you, Your Honor.
The laminar flow hood is designed for the applications where you're concerned about either contaminating an item or being contaminated by that item. That's what they're designed for. That's what their purpose is. A chemical fume hood was designed for an entirely different purpose, which is not appropriate for handling those kind of samples.
If you're working in a DNA laboratory, in your opinion, is it important to know the difference between a chemical hood and a laminar flow hood?
Same objection, same grounds.
Oral.
Yes, it's important.
Now, you were asked many questions on cross-examination concerning your conclusions about incorrect typing results by the Los Angeles Police Department personnel on mock validation studies and proficiency tests. Do you recall those?
Yes, I do.
All right. First, I'd like to address the mock validation studies. Excuse me, Ryan, I'm sorry. Now, I'm going to show you some slides, but first I'd like to just refresh everybody's recollection with showing the raw data. The first mock validation study was one, if you could pull back, done by Mr. Yamauchi on September 9th. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And this is where he was typing a vaginal swab with an epithelial fraction
Yes.
and a sperm fraction.
Yes.
All right? And you testified he got an incorrect typing result.
That's correct.
Then the second one was the same set of samples typed on September 21st by Aaron Riley. You recall that?
I do.
Now, Your Honor,
Yeah, Mr. Harris, which exhibits are those?
this is, first one is 561 is the September 9th. 562 is the September 21st.
Thank you.
All right, now I'd like to turn to the slide marked, what's the defendant's next in order? 1314? I can't hear.
1313.
1313, and I guess we'll call this A1. All right, Dr. Gerdes, what does this represent?
On the far left, it represents the correct type for this particular mock validation specimen. So the little symbol on top there stands for the male fraction. The male fraction should be a 1.2, 1.3. The next one below, the epithelial cell, or the female fraction, should be 1.24.
What was the LAPD type?
On the sperm fraction, the LAPD found a 1.24.
And is that a correct type in your opinion?
No, you can see it does not match the anticipated male pattern that should have been there. The 1.2, 1.3 is not equal to 1.24.
We have the next slide, please. All right. Tell us what this represents in terms of the consequences of that mistyping.
What that means is given the LAPD type of 1.24, if the suspect were a 404, a 1.24, or a 1.2, 1.2, all of those individuals would be included as having matched that male fraction.
Is that one of the reasons you think this is a mistake?
Yes, because these suspects would have been wrongly accused.
Next slide. What does this represent?
Well, since the true and correct type was missed, the 1.2, 1.3 was missed, the true perpetrator would not have been recognized. And so he would have been excluded falsely. So again, that's an error.
The second slide I should note was B, and this third slide is C.
That's correct.
And are these among the reasons that you believe that these were erroneous typings?
Yes.
Is this one reason you disagree with the statement in the validation study that no incorrect results were observed?
Yes.
All right. I'd like now to turn to the next. You also discussed two other errors in proficiency tests. First one, just to show the raw data. Could you pull back a little bit, please? So we can see the board. Now, what were these set of samples on July 14th?
These are proficiency samples that were part of a proficiency test.
And what does that mean? Where do the samples come from?
They come from an external source.
All right. Are they supposed to have contaminants in them?
No.
All right. And this was the run done by Aaron Riley on 7/14/93,
Correct.
where you found an incorrect typing?
That's correct.
Right. And is this the raw data for when she did it again on?
She repeated it on 7/15.
Okay, thank you. Now could we turn to the next set of slides that I'll ask to be marked defendants 13,
14. And ask slide number 1, which we'll call 1314A. Now, could you please explain to the jury what this data represents?
Well, this is the 7/14/93 proficiency samples. And on that particular date, the female reference sample number 1 was typed by LAPD as a 1.34. And the correct type is a 1.24.
Now, what is it says number 8 negative control? What does that represent?
The control that is supposed to be a negative control, it should have no DNA whatsoever, in this case, showed the indication of DNA, and that DNA was typable as including 1.2 and 4 alleles.
All right. Could we have the next slide, please, which will be 1314B? What does this indicate?
Well, the LAPD type was a 1.34. The alleles that were found on the negative control include a 1.24, and from that we can conclude that the 1.3 was not detected on the negative control.
Now, in other words, you're saying this means that there was contamination that caused an incorrect type here that was not detected by the negative control.
That's correct.
Now, in your review of the LAPD lab, in your study of contamination of runs and contaminations of strips, in how many instances did you detect contamination that was not picked up by the negative control? In other words, the negative control was blank, but you nonetheless saw contamination.
28% of the times.
Now, let's go to the, then this represents the typing by Aaron Riley on 7/14.
Correct.
Now, you remember Mr. Clarke asked you questions about what would you, did Aaron Riley do the right thing when she typed it again? And you said yes, correct?
Yes.
But at that time, could you please further explain what the answer to that question?
Certainly. The correct procedure actually would be the minute you see any indication of contamination, you need to shut down your operation, you need to clean up with bleach, you need to make new reagents, you need to identify the source of the contamination, do a large number of negative controls to make sure they're clean and that you've gotten away from whatever the problem is, and only then do you repeat the test and go on.
Now, should those steps, in terms of documenting the contamination and the efforts to correct it, be documented?
Yes.
Were those documented in the data you saw from the Los Angeles Police Department?
No.
Just what is the significance in terms of contamination that these are proficiency test samples that come from an outside source and you see this contamination?
It simply means that the laboratory has introduced this contaminant into the specimen.
And the contamination here caused, in your judgment, an incorrect typing.
Excuse me, objection leading also calls for speculation.
Sustained. Answer stricken. Rephrase the question.
Could we have the next slide, please, which would be 1314C? Is this the...
This is the rerun on 7/15/93 of that same proficiency test. And again, number 1, the female reference sample was once again typed as 1.34, indicating that they did nothing to remove the contaminant. It's still there. It's still causing the same error. The correct type should have been a 1.24. And on this particular occasion, the negative control was once again showing DNA. And the DNA that was shown is a 1.2, 1.3 this time.
Next slide, please. 1314D, I believe.
So again, there is an incorrect type on the sample itself.
Next slide, please.
The contaminating alleles of this particular run were a 1.2 and a 4.
Next, on 714, the contaminating alleles were...
A 1.2 and a 4.
All right, and next slide.
And the contaminating runs on 715 are 1.2 and a 1.3.
Next slide.
So between those 2 days, you can see how random this process is. What we have is a 1.3 has now appeared on the negative control strip, and the 4 contaminant has disappeared.
Is this any way to run a railroad?
Excuse me, objection argumentative.
Excuse me, is this any way to run a DNA laboratory?
Same objection, Your Honor. Also,
No.
it's also beyond the scope of the witness expertise.
Just briefly, Mr. Clarke asked you about other PCR-based techniques. For example, he asked you about laboratories that can detect a single cell. Do you recall those questions?
I do.
When laboratories are amplifying up and doing a PCR-based technique on a single cell, how many negative controls do they ordinarily use for that application?
Objection, no foundation.
They would use generally 10 for each sample.
And why is that?
When you're looking at something of that low a concentration, you need to be absolutely sure that you are not getting contamination.
And would it be a fair statement that depending on the application, different controls are necessary?
Yes.
Now, you were asked a whole series of questions about not having done forensic samples in your own laboratory and not attending forensic meetings. Do you recall that?
I remember those.
And incidentally, you were asked some questions about attending forensic meetings at the FBI. You recall those?
I remember.
And can anybody go to those FBI meetings?
No, you need to be invited.
They ever invited you?
No.
Now, you can go to other forensic meetings voluntarily, is that correct?
Yes, you can.
Now, you have criticized here, have you not, the method that the Los Angeles Police Department personnel used in collecting the blood swatches wet in plastic bags? You recall that?
I do.
To evaluate the scientific merits of that procedure, do you believe that you're unable to do so because you have not attended forensic meetings,
No.
that you haven't done specifically forensic samples in your laboratory?
No.
What is your opinion based upon?
I think the fundamental science here is basically microbiology, because that's the science that deals with how to manipulate and handle samples in such a way to prevent cross-contamination and to prevent them from becoming degraded.
And your experience as a DNA laboratory director, does that have relevance here too?
Yes.
In terms of the procedures followed on June 13th in taking the swatches out of the plastic bags from Bundy and Rockingham, not changing gloves, not changing papers when put into test tubes, do your criticisms of that depend upon, in your judgment, attendance at forensic meetings or doing forensic samples?
No.
What about the methods used for taking those samples out of the test tubes by scraping and creating aerosols? Does your criticism of that depend upon attendance of forensic meetings or running forensic samples?
No.
What are those criticisms based on?
Once again, the fundamental issue here is understanding how those manipulations can cause cross-contamination. That's a microbiology issue.
Is it an issue also in terms of...
In a DNA or molecular biology PCR lab, those are molecular biology, fundamental science issues.
In terms of handling Mr. Simpson's reference sample in the way that Mr. Yamauchi did, along with the Rockingham glove and all the Bundy blood drop swatches between 9 and 11 o'clock on the morning of June 14th, in terms of your criticisms of that, do you believe that it is necessary to attend forensic meetings?
No.
Objection calls for speculation.
Do you believe that not having done forensic samples in your laboratory makes you unable to evaluate that?
No.
What are your criticisms based on in terms of your background and experience?
Once again, it's a fundamental question of basic training in microbiology and molecular biology as to how to handle these items that contain very small amounts of material in such a way so that you don't have the risk of creating error and cross-contamination.
Mr. Clarke asked you about the fact that you once testified for a prosecutor and in other times testified for defense lawyers. You recall that?
Yes.
Objection misstates the evidence.
Does it, in terms of, does it matter to you which side you testify for?
No.
Upon what do you make your decisions as to, in terms of your testimony?
I'm asked to evaluate the science as to whether the science is fundamentally sound, and that's what I express an opinion about.
You testify for either side.
Correct.
Now, you were asked some questions about the money that you've been paid in this case and your salary. Do you recall those?
Yes.
And you recall the questions that you were being paid at what, the rate of $100 an hour here?
That's correct.
And that your salary at IAD is not at $100 an hour. You recall those questions?
Yes.
Now, first of all, do you personally receive the money that you get from this case or any others where you testify as a witness?
No, all of the charges go directly to my laboratory.
And in terms of the amount of money that, you write grant proposals, is that correct?
Yes.
And as part of that, do you have to make an assessment of how much it costs IAD to have you as an employee?
Yes, that's part of writing a budget for a grant.
And is the expenditure of money that IAD pays you reflected merely in your salary?
No, you have an additional 43% in indirects and benefits.
All right. And when you're away from the laboratory, does IAD, is there an opportunity cost for IAD? Could you
Yes.
explain what that term is?
Well, since I'm not at the laboratory, my function at the laboratory is to promote the work of that laboratory, so my productivity is lost. It's not just my time, but my productivity in terms of working in a lab and getting business for that laboratory is lost to the company.
Now, this is the last line of questions, Your Honor. Dr. Gerdes, you indicated that over a 5-year period, you have testified in court about 23 times.
That's correct.
All right. And in those cases, your CV has been put into evidence,
Yes,
and you've been questioned extensively about your background.
yes,
And you indicated, I think at the very beginning of the cross-examination, that there came a period of time, you indicated you got your PhD in 4 years at UCLA?
correct,
Then you did postgraduate work for 3 years?
correct,
Also at UCLA?
correct.
Then you moved to Hawaii.
No, then I went to Denver
Denver, I'm sorry.
as an assistant professor for 4 years first.
And then you moved to
Then
Hawaii.
I moved to Hawaii.
All right. And you were asked about that, right?
Yes.
Why did you move to Hawaii and sort of get off this track?
Well, it was a personal decision. I had a small son, and I decided to play Mr. Mom for a few years, and so we went to Hawaii.
Your wife had an opportunity there?
She had an opportunity for a job.
And you indicated, why did you, could you explain a little bit about why you had to be on television when you taught these classes at the community college?
Well, in Hawaii, there are a series of islands, and it's just the best way to communicate to remote sites.
And finally, Dr. Gerdes, you were asked about working for the pineapple factory. You recall that?
Yes.
All right. Does that have some relevance to the issue of contamination?
In fact, it does.
Could you please tell this jury what you did for the pineapple company?
Well, the pineapple company had a problem with their cans blowing up. In fact, they had...
What do you mean by blowing up?
Well, they would swell up and then just explode. And basically, they had some of the workers injured, in fact, from this. So I was called in to track down why those cans were blowing up, and it turned out to be bacterial contamination.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gerdes.
Mr. Clarke?
Yes, thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Gerdes, with regard to finding DNA on a steering wheel, is that unexpected?
Finding DNA on a steering wheel?
Yes.
Not necessarily. This is an extremely sensitive technique. It might find it there.
In other words, someone might have driven a car and left DNA from driving the car, is that right?
That's correct.
Might have nothing to do with blood, is that right?
That's true.
And blood could in fact be deposited on top of the DNA that somebody left driving the car a week earlier.
That's true.
Your Honor, if I might, I would like to utilize, and I just can't remember the number, but the defense Bronco board. It was displayed earlier this morning.
Well, we'll trust Mr. Wooden to find it.
I think it's near the top.
All right, this is 1309.
Yes. Thank you, Your Honor. Now, Dr. Gerdes, if I can refer your attention, perhaps I can get the pointer. And in particular, with respect to this, should we call it a yellow dot that's pointing up that says called real, that's referring to the signal or the dot just to the right of the 1.3 allele, correct?
Correct.
And with regard to that particular dot, that was a part of the Department of Justice interpreting as minor alleles, in other words, not as strong as the 1.1 and 1.2, the type 1.3, 4. Is that right?
That's correct.
Now, with regard to that, and Your Honor, at this point I'd like to have marked as people's next in order. Not the pointer.
573.
actually, do you have, perhaps I can do it this way. Dr. Gerdes, do you have copies of the Department of Justice's raw notes?
Yes.
Okay. And would there in fact be a one-page sheet showing the way that the Department of Justice viewed these strips and made notations about types?
Yes.
Okay. If I could then, what I think I'll do is show you this. I'm showing you what will be marked, I'm sorry, 573. 573. First of all, Dr. Gerdes, does that appear to be a Xerox copy of one of those typing sheets from the Department of Justice?
Yes.
And does that appear to be a document that you also have a Xerox copy of?
Yes.
Okay. And Your Honor, with regard to this exhibit, I would ask to place it on the overhead projector. And Dr. Gerdes, just from looking at the sheet from a distance, is item number 31 what's labeled DNA 18? In other words, what would be the third row from the top?
Yeah, I'd like to double check
Sure.
that just because it's confusing with
Please
the
do.
numbers. That's correct.
Okay. Now, if we focus on the third row down, labeled DNA 18, inside those boxes are a scoring system wherein the analyst looks at the strips and then assigns each of those dots a frequency, an intensity, that is how dark it is, relative to the C dot. Is that right?
That's correct.
All right, then, Your Honor, if we could zoom in on DNA 18, a little bit more, that's fine. And Dr. Gerdes, if you could you tell us where the scoring for the 1.3 dot would be on this particular sample, which is DNA 18 but is LAPD number 31? Sure.
It would be under the 1.3 column, so it would be right here.
So that particular 1.3 dot was scored by the analyst, or actually analysts, is that correct?
Yes, there are two analysts.
Was Renee Montgomery the analyst in this particular instance?
Yes.
And who else read that chart, read that strip as well?
Confirming analyst, I believe, was Gerdes Sims, yes. Over in the corner over there. GAS, Gerdes Sims.
Now, referring to that particular interpretation, is it then correct that both analysts scored the 1.3 dot as the same intensity as the C dot?
They state that it's approximately equal to the C on their interpretation, yes.
Actually, they note that in two different locations on this particular scoring sheet, don't they?
Yes. The arrow right now is pointing to that notation.
Okay, the first indication is where it's labeled C, is that correct?
On the strip squares themselves, yes.
That's to the left of the arrow?
Yes.
And perhaps if we could just point to the C.
Talking about this C?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
And then it's indicated here as well.
So in other words, that is off to the right, it is indicated 4, approximately the same as C, approximately the same as 1.3.
That's what's indicated.
Incidentally, was Dr. Blake present during this particular analysis?
It states that in the corner of the document, so apparently he was.
Now, going back to the user guide, in fact, directs the user that any signal at an intensity of the C dot or higher is a positive signal that can be called, correct?
That's what they state.
That's what the user guide says, correct?
Correct.
And in fact, the user guide is the same user guide that you described as containing accepted scientific procedures, correct?
Yes, I've stated that I agree with parts of it and I disagree with others, yes.
With respect to the interpretation of dots at the intensity level of the C dot or above, that's a correct procedure, isn't it?
Again, I disagree with that aspect of it because it's in the presence of a mixture, and when you have a mixture, the dot intensity question becomes confused because the C dot is really developed by the presence of the primary contributor. So using that as a relative gauge is no longer something that I would do.
It is, in fact, what Roche Molecular Systems describes as an appropriate way to interpret the presence of types, correct?
I believe if you read the user guide, they themselves state that in the presence of mixtures, you should use extreme caution.
And in fact, they state that you should use caution in interpreting any mixture, correct?
That's correct.
But they also state that a signal that is equal to the C dot or greater is a positive signal that can be interpreted as present, correct?
That's what they state.
Now, I'd like to shift, if I could then, Your Honor, to what I believe to be 1310, but it's a similar board dealing with the Bundy drop. Now, Dr. Gerdes, showing you what's been marked Exhibit 1310. You stated that you felt that it was arbitrary to call the 1.3 dot as present with regard to item number 31, the bronchoconsole, correct?
Right.
When it's not called as part of item number 52, which is the Bundy blood drop, as reflected on the typing strip on Defendant's Exhibit 1310, correct?
That's my opinion.
Now, I have an additional page I would like marked as, I believe, People's 574.
Yes.
Dr. Gerdes, showing you what will be marked People's 574, does that appear to be a similar typing sheet from the Department of Justice that includes the DQ alpha typing of the Bundy blood drop number 52?
This is the typing that was performed on 1031, yes.
October 31st?
Yes, it was typed twice.
All right, then, Your Honor, with the court's permission, may I display this sheet?
Yes.
Now, this was a typing, and I believe you described previously that there were actually 2 DQ alpha typing runs on number 52 at the Department of Justice, correct?
That's correct.
Now, that is also referred to by the Department of Justice as DNA 55A.
Yes.
Then would it be correct that the second row down, that is the second row below the first row,
It's right here, yes.
reflects those typing results on the Bundy drop LAPD item 52?
That's correct.
Now, with regard to the 1.3 allele, let's start with, and who was the analyst?
The analyst, again, was Renee Montgomery.
And was there a second reader or confirming analyst?
Gary Sims.
With respect to their viewing of that original strip and the 1.3 allele, what did they note about that particular dot?
They state that there's a trace and that it's less than the C.
Actually, under the 1.3 box, they state C-/trace, correct?
Correct.
Meaning that the intensity of that dot was less than the C dot, correct?
That's what they see. That's correct.
Now, turning to the far right, under comments, there is actually some more notations that include C greater than 1.3,
Correct.
meaning that the 1.3 dot was less intense than the C dot.
That's correct.
And then is there also a notation that appears to have Gary Sims' initials?
Yes.
And what does Mr. Sims note there?
He also states it's C minus, which was less than C.
The intensity of that dot with regard to item number 52 then was less than the C dot, correct?
Correct.
In comparison to item number 31, the intensity of the 1.3 dot relative to the C dot was different, wasn't it?
Yes.
And the user guide prescribes appropriate ways of interpreting evidence when dots are either equal to or greater than the C dot versus less than the C dot.
Once again, I disagree with that, but they do.
Objection, move to strike. Your Honor, non-responsive.
Overruled.
The user guide provides that those are different interpretations to be made or suggested to be made to analysts, correct?
Yes.
So in reality, what you have called not real in this situation and real with regard to item number 31 are two different situations, aren't they?
Well, the other aspect of this that you didn't mention is the fact that these 1.3s are showing up on the control strips.
Well, what I'm asking, though, Dr. Gerdes, is with respect to item 52, the 1.3 is less than the C, correct?
Yes.
With respect to QC 877, the 1.3 is less than the C, isn't it?
Yes.
And with regard to the positive control, the 1.3 noted by the analysts is less than the C dot, correct?
Yes.
All of the samples in this particular series of 3 on Defendant's Exhibit 1310 showed 1.3 alleles less than the C dot, correct?
Yes.
And in fact, that C dot is very important in the interpretation of results, correct?
It's important when you know you don't have a mixture.
Incidentally, Doctor, perhaps we can remove the board. Incidentally, in your laboratory, these protocols that exist, you want your analysts to follow the protocols that you have in place in the lab, correct?
Yes.
Now, I'd like to turn your attention, if I can, to the area of the Bundy drops, number 47 through 50, as well as 52, and in particular, the potential you raised of cross-contamination. Do you recall that testimony?
Yes, I do.
First of all, you've made no studies about cross-contaminating, that is, cross-contamination among forensic samples, correct?
I haven't done any studies myself, no.
You've had no training whatsoever in evidence collection techniques as used by police?
No.
You have no personal experience in evidence collection of any manner, correct, as far as forensic samples?
I believe I've answered that, yes.
And you've conducted absolutely no validation studies involving forensic samples, correct?
That's correct.
Do you believe you are as qualified as Gary Sims to offer an opinion to this jury about proper methods of evidence collection?
I think I've seen a wealth of evidence that has been introduced, and with my experience in microbiology, I feel I'm adequately qualified to speak to those issues.
Do you feel you're as qualified as Gary Sims?
Speculation. Sustained.
Is there a term called hypothesis testing?
Yes.
What's that mean?
Well, a hypothesis is an explanation for something, and then testing it would be involved setting up an experiment to test it.
In other words, and perhaps you could tell us, what is a hypothesis?
A hypothesis is basically an explanation, and that is a possible explanation for something. And then testing it would involve designing, for instance, a scientific experiment to test how likely that explanation is the true explanation.
And that's part of the scientific method?
Yes.
As we're taught in elementary school and higher education?
Yes.
As far as this issue of cross-contamination of samples, because your lab is not a forensic lab, you don't conduct any investigations into that type of potential, do you?
In any scientific endeavor, scientific results are documented, or should be if it's a scientific method, so that an independent analyst who's trained in the science can look at, doesn't have to do the experiments. He can look at the data and do hypothesis testing based on the data. And it's frequently done in the scientific fields.
As far as your hypothesis, that is, of the potential that these Bundy blood drops were cross-contaminated, you have conducted absolutely no testing to test whether or not that could occur in forensic samples, correct?
I have looked at the data as objectively as possible in terms of the results that the LAPD produces on validation and other specimens, and based on that, I can make conclusions about the likelihood of that hypothesis.
Have you conducted any physical tests to prove whether or not that could happen the way you have suggested it might?
No, I haven't.
With regard to item number 47, can you tell us how much DNA was in that blood drop when it was deposited, when the person bled?
Before it degraded, no.
Is that also true of item number 48,
That's true.
49,
Yes,
50,
yes,
and 52?
yes.
And in fact, the levels of DNA in a blood stain can be the level of DNA that was left there by the blood donor instead of from cross-contamination, correct?
That's possible.
You don't know how much bacteria was present on any of these surfaces, do you?
Well, I know there was enough bacteria to cause substantial degradation.
You have conducted no tests to determine if the amount of bacteria, for instance, in item number 47 was the same on through out to item number 52 on the back driveway, have you?
As far as quantitating the bacteria, no.
Is it important? Well, let me rephrase that. Would it be a factor in determining how much degradation occurred to know how much bacteria was in each of those samples?
You know, I think that the critical aspect of this is how much degradation there is on the DNA, not how much bacteria is there.
Isn't it important to know how much DNA was there to start with?
There's no way of determining that.
Is it important to
It
know
would
that?
be, if you could determine that, it would be important.
Because that would tell you how much degradation actually occurred from bacteria. Isn't that right?
Yes,
As far as item number 117, and so we're clear, item number 52 was a blood stain on the back driveway, correct?
correct,
Item number 117 was a blood stain on the back gate.
correct.
Is it your testimony that the conditions where the blood was actually recovered from was the same for item 52 as it was for 117?
It wasn't the exact location. I think it was in the same general area, so I would anticipate the conditions would be approximately the same.
Well, wasn't one of them found on a driveway, a surface that is flat?
Yes,
Wasn't one of them found on a vertical surface or something at an up and down location?
yes,
As far as the collection of items number 115, 116, and 117, first of all, they're all from the back gate, correct?
correct.
Can you tell us how long they were in plastic bags after they were recovered?
As far as I know, that's not known.
Is that an important fact in comparing relative DNA amounts and relative bacterial degradation?
It might have some bearing, but I wouldn't anticipate it would be a major difference in terms of the amount of time.
You have criticized the use of plastic bags in terms of collecting evidence and transporting it and storing it in plastic bags, correct?
Correct.
Wouldn't the amount of time that a wet blood stain was in a plastic bag be very important in determining degradation?
It would be relevant.
It would be more than relevant, wouldn't it?
It would be important.
What time of the day were 115, 116, and 117 collected?
I think it was in the afternoon, but I'm not 100% sure on that. I'd have to look it up.
Do you know how hot it was that day?
No,
Isn't that important?
it could have some relevance.
Well, it could have a good deal of relevance in terms of comparing relative degradation amounts, correct?
Yes.
Can you tell us how long 115 through 117 were in their plastic bags in the truck?
I haven't seen that written anywhere. I'm not sure. I'm not aware of that.
Wouldn't that be important to know also to compare degradation of those samples versus degradation due to bacteria of the original Bundy blood drops?
It would, but those are a month older to begin with, too, so it's kind of hard to figure out what's going on here.
Well, a blood stain on a gate isn't the same as a wet blood stain in a plastic bag, is it?
No.
In fact, when blood dries, it becomes, well, let me rephrase that. Isn't dried blood a much better form to store blood in to preserve its DNA content than wet blood?
That's true.
In fact, dried blood stains are capable of being typed after weeks, months, years, or even decades in some instances, correct?
That's been claimed.
Well, hasn't that been demonstrated by the scientific literature?
Yes.
Aren't all of these factors, when an item was collected, how much DNA was present, how much bacteria was present, how the items were stored, temperatures, and each of the items that we have just discussed, aren't they all important factors in rendering an opinion about relative degradation in one sample and another?
Yes.
And you have rendered that opinion of comparing 117 with 52 without knowing information or having information about each of these factors that we've just described.
Not all of those are known, but the fact is it's an older sample, and my opinion is based on that.
Say that one of the samples was a month older. Which one are you talking about?
They were collected later.
Is that the only comment you're making, as far as a 1 month period?
You're starting at a different starting point
And by starting point, what do you mean?
in terms of how old the specimen was before it was collected.
Isn't it correct that you cannot testify that those samples weren't deposited at the same time or within minutes of one another?
I'm not talking about when they were deposited, I'm talking about when they were collected.
Well, I'm referring now to when they were deposited. From your review of these materials, you cannot state that those two samples weren't deposited within minutes of each other, can you?
As far as when they were deposited, no.
Now, I believe, Dr. Gerdes, you described the fact that from your review of the materials, and I'm referring to the LAPD validation studies, that you could find no instance in which there was more than one run on the same day?
In the table that I looked at, yes,
Okay.
that I derived.
So you're going only by the chart that you made, is that right?
Yes.
As far as the materials that you have, and I'm referring to the validation studies, do you only have in your possession those particular records where you charted an event like contamination, in your opinion?
No, I have the complete set of records.
Okay. Can I refer your attention then to the date of May 6, 1994 in your records?
Yes.
And in particular, who is the analyst on the first run that you show for May 6th?
Colin Yamauchi.
Do you show a second run on May 6th by Aaron Riley?
No, I don't.
All right. marked as people's next in order.
575.
Consists of 2 hybridization records, and I'll have the witness further authenticated. Dr. Gerdes, could you take a moment to look at those 2 documents? Is the court going to take a break at a particular time?
As soon as you finish.
With this area?
This is a relatively minor point.
I understand.
I don't have these particular documents.
All right. Well, perhaps we can just shorten it. Do those appear to be 2 runs on the same day, one by Aaron Riley and one by Colin Yamauchi?
They appear to be, but these particular cases involve casework, and I believe they weren't, I was not given these.
Well, weren't you allowed to see each of the testings in their books, that is the LAPD books, including polymarker as well as casework?
Yes, but they were not provided as part of discovery, and there weren't additional discovery that I obtained.
Weren't you allowed to look at the original records of those?
Yes.
Keep
I
going.
don't have much longer, but I have more than 5 minutes, let's say.
Keep going.
Would it be possible to take a break, Your Honor, to collect a few items as well? I assure the court it will not be lengthy.
How much time do you need?
How much for the testimony time? Probably about 10 to 15 minutes, but I need to collect some items if I could.
Okay. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take our mid-afternoon recess at this time. Remember all my admonitions to you, and we'll stand in recess until 3 o'clock. All right, Dr. Gerdes, you can step down. All right, back on the record in the Simpson matter. Deputy McNair, let's have the jurors, please. I take it, Mr. Clarke, you have all your exhibits that you need to conclude?
Yes.
All right. Seated. Dr. Gerdes. All right, let the record reflect that we've been rejoined by all the members of our jury panel. Dr. John Gerdes is again on the witness stand undergoing a recross examination by Mr. Clarke, who is about to conclude his recross examination.
Thank you, Your Honor.
You're welcome.
Dr. Gerdes, just returning, if I could, for a few moments to the area of different levels of DNA in samples. You've described age as a factor that can impact how degraded a DNA sample is, correct?
Yes.
That's not the only factor that impacts that, is it?
No, there are multiple factors involved.
The substrate, the surface that a stain is on, can impact it.
That's possible.
The way a sample is packaged, let's say, after it's collected.
That's possible.
Whether the sample is collected in a relatively wetter or drier state impacts that rate of degradation,
That's true.
and temperature can impact that rate of degradation as well.
True.
So those are a series, or at least 4 or 5 or 6 examples of factors that can affect how a sample degrades and at what rate.
Correct.
Now, you described, Dr. Gerdes, your opinion that 28% of the time that there was a contaminant in your examination of the LAPD PCR typing that was not shown in the negative control.
Correct.
Now, that is dependent on how you've used the term contaminant through all of your review of that material, correct?
Correct.
That includes dots or reactions from the various types that are less than the C dot, correct?
Correct.
And in fact, from your review of the LAPD, that includes a very large number of samples that in fact had reactions that you classified as a contaminant that were less than the C dot, correct?
That's correct.
In fact, that C dot is very important in interpreting results, correct?
It's important in interpreting a single sample known to be from a known individual.
Is there any instance in this case in which a dot is called as a genuine result where it's less than this C dot?
I don't recall. I think there are some that are very close in terms of my interpretation versus theirs from looking at the strips.
In this case, as to the results, and sorry, your answer was you don't recall, but you think there may have been?
I think there may have been.
As far as samples that are called, again, in this case, isn't the fact that reactions are at the C dot or higher very important in determining the accuracy of results?
I've expressed my opinion on that.
Well, I'm sorry, Dr. Gerdes. What my question is to you is, isn't it a fact that in calling results in this case, whether those results are at or above the C dot is in fact very important in calling DQ alpha results?
It's important in determining that you have a minimum amount of DNA, yes.
And in fact, that's just what the user guide recommends, isn't it?
Yes.
It's what the package insert, that little insert that comes with the kits, recommends also, isn't it?
Yes.
And in fact, it's what Gary Sims followed in this case, isn't it?
Yes.
It's what Renee Montgomery followed in this case.
Yes.
It's what Robin Cotton and Paula Yates and Julie Cooper followed in this case, correct?
Yes.
It's what Colin Yamauchi followed in this case.
Yes.
As far as these kits from Roche, you don't have any complaints with Roche about the quality of the kits they manufacture, do you?
No.
They manufacture the DQ Alpha kit,
Yes.
the D1S80 kit,
Yes.
the polymarker kit,
Yes.
and in fact, you use your own kit for, well, let me rephrase that. You use the Roche manufactured kit to test chlamydia in clinical casework, correct?
That's correct.
Now, earlier, you described the fact that, in your opinion, contamination at the LAPD was predominantly in the reagent extraction controls. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And you used the term at early stages, that is, at early stages in the DNA typing process. Is that right?
That's correct.
Where is that shown? Let me rephrase that. As far as contamination shown in the early phases or early stages in this case, where is that shown in the controls that were run in this case?
The substrate controls were clean in this particular case.
Well, weren't the other controls negative as well in this case?
The two reference samples showed evidence of cross-contamination. Other than that, the other controls were clean.
Reagent blanks?
Yes.
Positive amplification controls?
Yes.
Negative amplification controls?
Yes.
Quality control samples?
Yes.
Aren't the fact that those controls all operated properly, isn't that an extremely important fact in evaluating the reliability of the results in this case?
In this particular case, you're dealing with very degraded samples and with low levels of DNA. It introduces a new situation in terms of how well those controls would be expected to work, as we discussed on